The problem nobody could solve. The galaxy's greatest mystery. For 3,000 years, the Galactic Council had a problem. Not a small problem. Not a problem they could ignore. This was the kind of problem that kept diplomats awake at night and made scientists pull their hair out in frustration. The problem was the silence. Across the galaxy, there were 847 known intelligent species. They traded, talked, argued, and worked together. They had built an amazing civilization that spanned millions of star systems. But there was one thing they could never do. They could never truly understand each other. Universal translators that weren't really universal. The galaxy used translation technology that was considered perfect. When a Vraxian spoke in their clicking, whistling language, the translator would convert it into words that a Kaltorian could understand. When a Kaltorian replied in their melodic tones, the Vraxian would hear clicks and whistles that made sense to them. On the surface, everything seemed fine. Trade agreements were signed. Treaties were honored. The galaxy functioned. But something was missing. Something important. Commander Zelthax of the Vraxian Diplomatic Corps was the first to put it into words during a late-night meeting with his Kaltorian counterpart, Ambassador Myron. They had been negotiating a mining rights agreement for 6 months. The contract was finally ready to sign. "Do you ever feel," Zelthax said carefully, "like we're not really talking to each other?" Myron's translator produced understanding clicks. "Yes. Every single day. We exchange information. We make deals. But I don't know if I've ever truly understood what you mean by anything." This was the silence. Not an absence of sound, but an absence of true communication. The translators converted words, but they couldn't translate meaning. They couldn't share context, culture, emotion, or the 1,000 tiny things that made communication real. The human arrives. Dr. Sarachin arrived at Galactic Council headquarters on a scholarship program. Earth had only joined the Council 15 years earlier, and humans were still considered newcomers. Interesting, but not particularly special. Sarah was a linguist. Not a diplomat or a scientist working on faster-than-light travel or exotic weapons. Just someone who loved languages and how people communicate. She was assigned to work in the translation services department. It was a boring job. She was supposed to review translator accuracy reports and file them in databases that nobody ever looked at. But Sarah noticed something in those reports. Something that everyone else had missed because they were too close to the problem. The translators were accurate. Perfectly accurate, in fact. When a Vraxian said the word graph, which meant approximately honor-bound duty with personal sacrifice, the translator converted it correctly into every other language. But here was the problem: no other language had a word that meant exactly that. So the translator would use 3 or 4 words, or sometimes a whole sentence, to express what was one word in Vraxian. Now multiply that across 847 languages. Multiply it by millions of conversations happening every day. Every single exchange lost something in translation. Small pieces of meaning disappeared, like water evaporating in sunlight. Over time, those small losses added up to the silence. A simple question. Sarah spent 6 months studying the problem. She read through decades of diplomatic records. She interviewed people from 200 different species. She asked them all the same question. When you talk to someone from another species, what do you wish they understood? The answers surprised her. They weren't about words or grammar. They were about feelings, assumptions, and ways of thinking. A Kaltorian merchant told her, "I wish they understood that when I say, 'maybe tomorrow,' I'm not being vague. In our culture, time flows differently. Tomorrow could mean next week. It's about the rhythm of events, not clock time." A Vraxian soldier said, "Humans always say 'I think' before giving opinions. We never do that. In our language, speaking is thinking. Separating them feels wrong, like lying." A Xantharian artist explained, "My people experience colors that yours can't see. When I describe a painting, the translator gives you words, but you're missing half the experience. How can we share art when we see different realities? Sarah compiled thousands of these responses. She saw a pattern. The silence wasn't a translation problem. It was a context problem. A culture problem. An empathy problem. The proposal nobody wanted. Sarah wrote a report. She presented it to her supervisor, a Kaltorian named Vresh who had worked in translation services for 40 years. The translators work perfectly, Sarah explained. But they only translate words. We need something that translates context. Something that helps people understand not just what was said, but why it was said and what it really means. Vresh's translator produced something that might have been a sigh. Dr. Chen, we've known about this problem for centuries. Every few years, someone proposes a solution. They all fail. Why? Because context is infinite. You can't program understanding. You can't create an algorithm for empathy. We've tried adding cultural databases to the translators. We've tried AI systems that learn cultural patterns. Nothing works. The silence remains. Sarah nodded slowly. What if we're not asking the right question? What if the translators aren't the problem? What if we are? Vresh's antennae twitched with confusion. Explain. The translators work instantly. Someone speaks, and immediately, you hear the translation. That's convenient. But it's also the problem. There's no time to think. No space to consider what was really meant. We've made communication so fast that we've forgotten how to actually understand each other. So what's your solution? Make translation slower? The council would never accept that. Sarah smiled. Not slower. Deeper. What if instead of replacing the translators, we taught people how to use them better? What if we helped everyone understand what gets lost in translation, so they could fill in the gaps themselves? Vresh was quiet for a long moment. That would require educating billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. It would take decades. Maybe centuries. Yes, Sarah agreed. But what else are we going to do? Keep having conversations where nobody really understands each other? Keep signing treaties based on words that mean different things to different people? The silence isn't going away on its own. The experiment. Vresh didn't reject Sarah's proposal. Instead, he did something unexpected. He forwarded it to the Council's Department of Cultural Exchange, with a note that said, "This probably won't work, but it might be worth trying on a small scale." That's how Sarah found herself leading a pilot program with 50 diplomats from 10 different species. The goal was simple: teach them about what their translators couldn't translate. The first session was a disaster. Sarah started by explaining how human languages have different concepts of time. How English speakers think of time as a line moving forward, while Mandarin speakers sometimes think of it as vertical. How these different mental models affect how people plan, remember, and imagine the future. A Vraxian diplomat interrupted. We know this already. Our cultural briefings cover these concepts. You know it intellectually, Sarah said. But do you feel it? When a human says they're looking forward to meeting you, do you understand that we're using a spatial metaphor for time? That we literally imagine the future as a place ahead of us? And when that shapes how we think about plans and commitments? The room fell silent. Sarah had touched something. A tiny crack in the silence. She continued. For the next 6 weeks, we're going to do exercises. Not just learning facts about each other's cultures. Actually experiencing how other species think and communicate. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to misunderstand each other. That's the point. We need to get comfortable with not understanding, so we can learn to bridge the gap. Small victories. The exercises were simple but profound. Sarah would give the group a scenario, plan a joint military exercise. Then she'd have them discuss it, but with rules. Humans, you can't use anytime words. No tomorrow, later, or deadline. Vraxians, you have to explicitly state whether you're expressing opinion or fact. Kaltorians, you need to explain your emotional context before making requests. It was awkward. Conversations that normally took 5 minutes stretched to an hour. People got frustrated. They argued. They misunderstood each other in new and creative ways. But something interesting happened. As they struggled to communicate without their normal shortcuts, they started really listening. Not just to words, but to intentions. To the feelings behind the words. To the unspoken assumptions that shaped every conversation. By week 3, the group was having breakthroughs. A human diplomat and a Xantharian scientist spent 4 hours trying to discuss the concept of beauty. They never fully agreed. The Xantharian still saw colors the human couldn't. But they reached something deeper, an understanding that their experiences of beauty were both valid, both real, even though they were different. This is what I wish everyone could feel, the Xantharian said. Not agreement. Understanding. Knowing that someone else's reality is as true as yours, even when it's completely different. That was the moment Sarah realized her program might actually work, breaking the silence. The resistance. Not everyone was happy about Sarah's program. In fact, most of the Galactic Council hated it. Councillor Thracax of the Vraxian Trade Federation was the loudest critic. He stood before the full council, his translator producing angry clicks. Dr. Chen's program is a waste of time and resources. She's teaching diplomats to have feelings about translation. This is not science. This is not practical. We have real problems to solve. Sarah sat in the observation gallery, watching the debate. She wasn't allowed to speak in full council sessions. She was too junior, too new, too human. But Ambassador Corinne, an elderly Kaltorian who had participated in Sarah's pilot program, stood up. Councillor Thracax, with respect, you're wrong. I've been a diplomat for 60 years. I thought I understood how to communicate across species. Dr. Chen's program showed me I was having surface conversations. I was exchanging information, but I wasn't connecting. Thracax's translator produced what might have been a scoff. Connecting? We're running a government, not a therapy session. Are we? Corinne challenged. Because I look at our records, and I see patterns. Trade disputes that could have been avoided with better understanding. Military tensions caused by misinterpreted intentions. Scientific collaborations that failed because research teams couldn't truly work together. How much has the silence cost us? The council chamber fell quiet. Nobody had ever calculated that cost. Nobody had wanted to. The real problem. Sarah's supervisor Vresh pulled her aside after the session. You need to understand something about the council. They're not resisting because your program doesn't work. They're resisting because it does work, and that's terrifying. I don't understand. The silence is comfortable, Vresh explained. It creates distance. That distance makes it easy to see other species as different, foreign, other. If people start really understanding each other, that distance disappears. Old assumptions crumble. Power structures shift. Some council members like things the way they are. Sarah felt her frustration rising. So we're supposed to just accept the silence? Keep pretending we understand each other when we don't? I'm not saying that. I'm saying you need to be strategic. You can't fight the council directly. You need to show them why breaking the silence benefits them. The crisis. 3 months after the council debate, a crisis erupted. The Vraxian Federation and the Kaltorian Alliance, 2 of the galaxy's largest powers, were on the brink of war over a disputed star system. The system contained rare minerals that both sides claimed. Diplomatic talks had broken down. Military fleets were mobilizing. The council was in emergency session, trying to prevent catastrophe. Sarah watched the negotiations and felt sick. This was exactly what Corinne had warned about. Both sides were using their translators. Both sides thought they understood each other. But the silence was destroying any chance of peace. The Vraxian representative kept saying Kal Thresh, which the translator rendered as rightful claim. The Kaltorian representative kept saying Mirathin, which translated to rightful claim as well. But Sarah had studied both languages. Kalthresh meant a claim based on strength and historical conquest. Mirathin meant a claim based on need and sustainable use. They were both saying rightful claim, but they meant completely different things. The translators made them sound like they were arguing about the same concept. In reality, they were talking past each other, neither side understanding what the other actually meant. Sarah did something that would probably end her career. She walked into the council chamber without permission and interrupted the session. "Stop," she said. Every eye in the room turned to her. "You're not having the same argument." Security moved toward her, but Ambassador Corinne raised a hand. "Let her speak." Sarah's heart pounded. The Vraxian representative is arguing from a framework of historical right through power. The Kaltorian representative is arguing from a framework of future need through sustainability. Your translators are making you sound like you disagree about who owns the system. But you're actually having two completely different conversations about what ownership means. Silence. Then Thrakax, the counselor who had opposed her program, spoke. "Prove it." The breakthrough. Sarah spent the next hour working with both delegations separately. She didn't have a magical solution. She couldn't make the dispute disappear. But she did something simple and powerful: she helped them understand what they were really arguing about. To the Vraxians, she explained Kaltorian environmental philosophy, how their concept of ownership was tied to being caretakers of resources for future generations. How Mirathin wasn't about who was strongest, but about who would use the resources most wisely. To the Kaltorians, she explained Vraxian honor culture, how their concept of ownership was tied to proving worth through historical deed and military strength. How Kal Thresh wasn't about greed, but about earning rights through action and sacrifice. Neither side changed their position. But something shifted. They stopped seeing each other as unreasonable opponents and started seeing each other as people with different, but valid, perspectives. The war didn't end because of Sarah. It ended because both sides, finally understanding each other's actual positions, found a compromise. The Vraxians would maintain symbolic sovereignty over the system, honoring their historical claim. The Kaltorians would manage resource extraction, ensuring sustainable use. Both sides got what they actually wanted, once they understood what the other side actually meant. The change. After the crisis, the Council's resistance to Sarah's program crumbled. Not because they had a sudden change of heart, but because they had seen what happened when the silence almost destroyed them. The program expanded. From 50 diplomats to 500. From 10 species to 50. Sarah trained other teachers, who trained more teachers. The technique spread. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. But slowly, across the galaxy, people started learning to communicate more deeply. Sarah's program had 3 core lessons. First, accept that translation is imperfect. Every conversation across species involves loss of meaning. That's not a problem to solve, it's a reality to acknowledge. Second, ask questions. When someone from another species says something that seems strange or unreasonable, they probably have a valid reason that makes sense in their context. Find out what that reason is. Third, share your context. Don't assume your translator is conveying everything. Explain not just what you think, but why you think it. Help others see your perspective. These lessons seemed simple. Almost obvious. But putting them into practice required something that had been missing from galactic civilization: patience. 5 years later, Sarah stood before the Galactic Council again. This time, she was presenting a report on the program's results. Over the past 5 years, she said, we've trained 50,000 diplomats, merchants, scientists, and educators in contextual communication. We've seen a 73% reduction in diplomatic incidents. Trade disputes are being resolved 40% faster. Joint scientific projects are producing better results. She paused, looking at the council members. But the real change isn't in those numbers. The real change is that people are talking to each other. Really talking. Not just exchanging words, but sharing understanding. Councillor Thrakax, who had opposed her so strongly 5 years ago, spoke up. Dr. Chen, I owe you an apology. I was wrong. Your program works. The silence is breaking. Sarah shook her head. The silence isn't breaking, Counselor. It's still there. It will always be there. We're just learning to bridge it. The lesson. The galaxy didn't become perfect. There were still misunderstandings. Still conflicts. Still moments when the translators failed to capture meaning. But something fundamental had changed. People stopped assuming that communication was automatic. They started recognizing that understanding required effort, patience, and genuine curiosity about how others think. The galaxy's greatest achievement wasn't faster-than-light travel or energy shields or artificial intelligence. It was learning that communication is hard, and that's okay. That the distance between minds is vast, and bridging it requires work. That understanding isn't about finding perfect translations, but about being willing to meet others halfway. Sarah Chen, a human linguist who just wanted to help people understand each other, had taught the galaxy's oldest and wisest civilizations a lesson they had forgotten. True communication isn't about speaking clearly. It's about listening deeply. The future. 10 years after Sarah's first report, the program had expanded to include billions of people across hundreds of worlds. It was taught in schools, integrated into diplomatic training, and becoming part of galactic culture. Sarah herself had moved on. She wasn't teaching anymore. She was working with a team of scientists and linguists from 30 species, trying to create a new kind of translator. Not one that would replace what they had learned, but one that would help. The new translator didn't just convert words. It flagged moments where meaning might be lost. It suggested questions to ask. It provided cultural context. It helped people bridge the silence themselves, rather than pretending the silence didn't exist. On Earth, Sarah's old linguistics professor asked her during a video call, "Did you ever imagine this would become so big?" Sarah laughed. "No. I just noticed a problem and tried to help fix it. I'm still just a linguist who loves languages." "You're more than that now. You changed the galaxy." "I didn't change anything," Sarah said. "I just reminded people of something they already knew but had forgotten, that understanding each other requires more than words. It requires caring enough to try." That was the real lesson of the silence. Not that translation is impossible, but that true communication requires something beyond technology. It requires empathy, patience, and a genuine desire to see the universe through someone else's eyes. The galaxy had spent 3,000 years looking for a technological solution to the silence. Sarah Chen, a human who had been part of galactic civilization for less than 2 decades, showed them that the solution wasn't technological at all. It was human. Not because humans were special or superior. But because humans, coming from a single planet with thousands of languages and cultures, had always known that communication is difficult. They had thousands of years of experience bridging gaps between people who saw the world differently. And now, that very human understanding of communication had become galactic. The silence wasn't broken. It would never be fully broken. But across the galaxy, billions of beings were learning to bridge it, one conversation at a time. And that was enough.